Welcome back to Part B of this episode of the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, an AMFT, ADHD, and OCD specialist, integrative mental health practitioner, and family systems coach. If you're just joining us here, this is the second half of our case study on Chelsea Handler's family vacation letter, and I'd encourage you to start with Part A first, since everything here builds directly on the Bowen Family Systems groundwork, the reciprocity and overfunctioning discussion, and the entitlement and learned helplessness concepts we covered there. If you've already heard Part A, let's pick up right where we left off. When we hear the word responsibility, our minds often drift toward observable behavior, whether making the bed, completing homework, arriving to work on time, paying bills, replacing what we have used, or remembering to thank someone for their generosity. Those behaviors certainly reflect responsibility, yet they are not where responsibility begins. They are, instead, the outward expression of a considerably deeper developmental process that has been unfolding since early childhood. As psychologists, we understand that responsibility is not a personality trait that someone simply possesses or lacks. Rather, it is a developmental capacity that emerges through repeated interaction between an individual's biology, temperament, family environment, cultural expectation, reinforcement history, and accumulated opportunity to experience both success and failure. Responsibility, in other words, is cultivated, practiced, and refined across thousands of seemingly ordinary moments that collectively shape how a person comes to understand their role within relationships and within the broader social world. This distinction matters considerably because when responsibility is reduced to a checklist of behaviors, we overlook the psychological mechanisms that actually produce those behaviors, and we may conclude mistakenly that someone is irresponsible because they forgot to contribute, failed to anticipate another's need, or neglected an important obligation. The more clinically useful question is not, why didn't they do it? But rather, what developmental experiences have shaped the way this individual understands responsibility, reciprocity, and participation within relationship? Among the foundational concepts in developmental psychology is social learning theory, developed by the psychologist Albert Bandura, which proposes that human beings acquire many behaviors not through direct instruction alone, but through observation, imitation, and reinforcement. Children continually study the adults around them, noticing who assumes responsibility, who avoids it, who repairs conflict, who expresses gratitude, who apologizes, who contributes without being asked, and who expects others to carry the emotional or practical burdens of everyday life. Long before a child comprehends the abstract concept of responsibility, they are already constructing an internal blueprint for how relationships function, asking questions they cannot yet articulate. Who usually solves problems? Who remembers everything? Who notices when someone is struggling? Who cleans up after everyone else? Who gets thanked? Who never gets thanked? Which behaviors receive attention? And which behaviors gradually become expected without comment? Those accumulated observations become part of what cognitive psychologists describe as schemas, mental frameworks that organize information and shape our expectations regarding how the world operates. Schemas allow us to predict what is likely to happen within familiar situations. And within families, children develop schemas concerning work, generosity, fairness, communication, conflict, affection, emotional expression, and responsibility itself. These schemas become remarkably powerful precisely because they often operate outside conscious awareness, so that a young adult may sincerely believe they are being considerate while simultaneously overlooking countless opportunities to contribute, simply because their internal model of family life has always included someone else anticipating those needs on their behalf. Conversely, another individual may experience considerable anxiety whenever something remains unfinished because their family system taught them, implicitly, that stability depended upon constant vigilance and uninterrupted productivity. This is precisely why Bowen Family Systems theory remains so clinically valuable, because Bowen recognized that individual behavior cannot be fully understood apart from the emotional system in which it developed. Families gradually organize themselves into predictable patterns of functioning. Responsibilities become distributed, roles become established, and expectations become normalized. And over time, those patterns often feel so familiar that they are mistaken for objective reality rather than recognized as relational habits that developed across years of repeated interaction. One concept I return to repeatedly within my clinical work is the distinction between assigned responsibility and internalized responsibility. Assigned responsibility occurs when another person directs behavior from the outside, as when a parent reminds a child to complete homework, a spouse asks their partner to take out the trash, or an employer provides a list of expectations, and the behavior occurs in these instances because someone else initiated it. Internalized responsibility, by contrast, is fundamentally different because it reflects the gradual integration of value, empathy, foresight, and executive functioning, and the individual notices what needs attention before anyone else points it out, recognizing that their contribution matters precisely because they understand themselves as an active participant within the system, rather than as a passive recipient of everyone else's effort. This distinction becomes particularly important when we discuss executive functioning, a collection of higher-order cognitive processes mediated primarily by the prefrontal cortex, including planning, organization, working memory, inhibitory control, sustained attention, cognitive flexibility, task initiation, and self-monitoring, all of which collectively allow us to translate intention into action. For individuals with ADHD, executive functioning develops differently, and the underlying challenge is rarely a lack of caring. More often, it reflects genuine difficulty coordinating multiple cognitive processes simultaneously. A young adult with ADHD may sincerely intend to replace the groceries they consumed, remember to thank their host, participate in household responsibility, or contribute to the group's needs, yet intention alone cannot guarantee execution when the neurological systems responsible for planning, sequencing, prioritizing, and prospective memory are functioning in a genuinely different way. Prospective memory deserves particular attention here because it is frequently misunderstood. Prospective memory refers to the capacity to remember at a future point an intended action, whether mailing a birthday card, refilling a prescription, bringing a dish to a family gathering, or replacing the bottle of olive oil finished the previous weekend, all of which depend on this particular cognitive function. When prospective memory is compromised, others may interpret a forgotten responsibility as indifference when, in clinical reality, it reflects a genuine difference in executive functioning rather than a deficit of care. This is precisely where Bowen's work and neurodevelopmental science intersect meaningfully, since Bowen helps us understand the relational pattern, while neuropsychology helps us understand the underlying neurological process, and neither framework replaces the other. Together, they provide a considerably richer account of human behavior than either could offer alone. Families raising children with ADHD often navigate a delicate balance because scaffolding, on one hand, is genuinely essential. Scaffolding refers to temporary supports that enable an individual to accomplish tasks that remain just beyond their current level of independent functioning, and calendars, visual reminders, checklists, alarms, shared planning sessions, body doubling, environmental organization, and structured routine all serve as examples. The purpose of scaffolding, however, is not permanence, but developmental progression, because effective scaffolding gradually transfers responsibility from the external environment toward the individual as competence increases. If the scaffold never changes, growth may become constrained. If it is removed prematurely, frustration and repeated failure often follow. This is one reason I encourage parents to reframe their question, moving from, "Can my child complete this task independently today?" toward, "What support allows my child to experience success while still increasing ownership over time?" That subtle shift transforms parenting, coaching, marriage, and leadership alike. The ultimate goal is never flawless execution. The ultimate goal is increasing capacity, because healthy family systems are not measured by how efficiently one person carries everyone else, but strengthened instead whenever each member gradually expands their own ability to recognize need, contribute meaningfully, repair mistakes, express gratitude, and understand that relationships thrive through reciprocal participation rather than concentrated effort. Perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden beneath Chelsea Handler's conversation, because her expectations were never merely about vacation etiquette. They invite us instead to ask a considerably larger developmental question. How do families intentionally cultivate adults who notice what needs to be done, appreciate what has been given to them, and willingly contribute to the emotional and practical well-being of the systems to which they belong? If there is one relationship in which responsibility is most frequently misunderstood, it is the relationship between a mother and her child, since few relationships demand the degree of physical, emotional, and cognitive investment that motherhood requires. From the moment a child enters the world, the mother's nervous system becomes exquisitely attuned to cues signaling hunger, fatigue, discomfort, illness, fear, delight, and distress. And developmental psychologists describe this process as attunement, the caregiver's capacity to accurately perceive, interpret, and respond to a child's internal emotional state. Attunement is not merely comforting, it is foundational to healthy brain development. And through thousands of repeated interactions, children learn that emotion can be recognized, organized, and regulated within the safety of relationship. Yet, one of the fascinating realities of development is that the very behaviors adaptive during infancy can become maladaptive if they remain unchanged across later developmental stages. Bowen Family Systems theory reminds us that healthy families are not static systems, but dynamic ones, continually reorganizing as each member grows, matures, and assumes new roles. And consequently, healthy parenting is not defined by performing the same task exceptionally well for 18 consecutive years. It is defined instead by a parent's willingness to continually recalibrate the relationship so that responsibility gradually transfers from parent to child in developmentally appropriate stages. This process requires extraordinary psychological flexibility because it asks mothers to resolve a genuine paradox. During the earliest years of life, excellent parenting often means anticipating a child's needs before that child can even communicate them. While as development progresses, excellent parenting increasingly requires resisting the impulse to anticipate every need so that the child can develop the capacity to recognize, organize, and respond to those needs independently. That particular transition is rarely discussed with the depth it genuinely deserves. Many mothers do not become over-involved because they desire control. They become over-involved because they possess tremendous observational capacity, noticing the backpack by the front door, remembering tomorrow's science project, recognizing that soccer practice ends 30 minutes earlier this week, and registering that the refrigerator is empty, the permission slip remains unsigned, the dog has not been fed, and the laundry still sits in the dryer. Their brains function as extraordinary pattern recognition systems, continuously scanning for any variable capable of disrupting the family's functioning. From a cognitive neuroscience perspective, this reflects the sustained engagement of executive functions such as planning, sequencing, prospective memory, cognitive flexibility, and prioritization. And within many families, mothers become the central repository for the household's collective executive functioning demand. Sociologists frequently describe this phenomenon as the mental load or cognitive labor of family life, and unlike physical chores, cognitive labor remains largely unseen, consisting of remembering, anticipating, coordinating, monitoring, and mentally tracking countless details that keep the family functioning smoothly. Because this labor remains largely unseen, it often goes unrecognized until the individual carrying it becomes genuinely exhausted. One concept I frequently discuss with parents is self-efficacy, the construct introduced by Bandura, referring to an individual's belief that they can successfully organize and execute the behaviors life's demands require. This belief is not primarily built through praise. It develops instead through accumulated experience, because every time a child forgets a lunch, problem solves a forgotten assignment, apologizes after making a mistake, manages disappointment, repairs a friendship, or navigates an unfamiliar situation, the brain gathers evidence confirming that difficult things are survivable. When mothers consistently intervene before a child encounters manageable difficulty, they are typically acting from profound love, attempting to reduce frustration, protect self-esteem, and create smoother daily routines. Family systems thinking, however, asks us to hold another question alongside compassion. What opportunities for growth might disappear when every obstacle is removed before the child has an opportunity to engage with it directly? Notice that I am not suggesting parents withhold support, since that would misrepresent both developmental science and Bowen's theory. Children require guidance, structure, and co-regulation, particularly during periods of overwhelming emotion. Co-regulation refers to the process through which a calm, regulated adult helps a child organize emotional and physiological arousal until the child gradually develops the capacity for self-regulation, and this remains one of the most powerful gifts a caregiver can offer. The developmental task, nonetheless, is progression, so that as a child's capacity expands, parenting evolves from doing for the child toward doing with the child, and ultimately toward supporting the child as they increasingly do for themselves. This distinction becomes especially significant within families raising children with ADHD, since ADHD is characterized by differences in executive functioning that affect planning, working memory, task initiation, inhibition, emotional regulation, sustained attention, and organization. A parent may look at a teenager's bedroom and immediately register 10 unfinished tasks, while the teenager may genuinely fail to perceive that same environment with equal salience, and that discrepancy does not necessarily reflect motivation or character. It reflects instead genuine differences in how attention is allocated, how information is prioritized, and how executive networks organize behavior. This is where clinical nuance becomes essential, because supporting a child with ADHD does not mean lowering expectation indefinitely, nor does it mean expecting them to perform as though their executive functioning differences did not exist. It requires instead the thoughtful use of scaffolding, temporary and intentional supports that bridge the gap between current ability and future independence, and a visual checklist, shared calendar, recurring routine, body double, or environmental cue is not a substitute for responsibility. It is a tool that increases the likelihood that responsibility can be successfully practiced. The critical question is always whether the scaffold is fostering greater ownership over time. If every reminder originates from the parent whose executive functioning is actually being strengthened, if every forgotten assignment is rescued before natural consequence occurs, whose problem-solving ability is actually expanding? If every emotional discomfort is removed immediately, when precisely does frustration tolerance develop? These questions are not criticisms. They are invitations to reflect on how love, anxiety, biology, and family pattern continuously interact with one another. I often encourage parents to become students of process rather than judges of outcome, so that instead of asking, Did my child remember? The more productive question becomes, what supports enabled success today? And what small responsibility can gradually become theirs tomorrow? That question honors both the neuroscience of ADHD and the developmental principle that independence is cultivated through repeated opportunity to participate meaningfully. I want to share an observation from my own practice here because it bears directly on everything we have just discussed. By the time a parent, and it is overwhelmingly a mother, finds her way to my office after listening to a considerable number of these podcast episodes, a fairly consistent picture has usually already formed. She is typically describing a son somewhere in his early to late 20s who has left school without finishing, who holds no job and expresses no active desire to find one, who spends the greater part of his day gaming, who uses marijuana and nicotine regularly, and who displays what she can only describe as a pervasive absence of motivation toward anything at all. The question she brings me, understandably, is why? The answer, more often than I would like, traces directly back to everything this episode has already covered. A scaffold that never transferred ownership to the child leaves that child, 20 years later, without the executive functioning architecture required to initiate tasks independently, because initiation itself was rarely his to practice. A perspective memory that was always outsourced to a parent never had the opportunity to strengthen through use. A nervous system protected for 2 decades from manageable frustration, disappointment, and failure never developed meaningful distress tolerance, which means that ordinary adult demands, a job application, a difficult conversation, a first failure at something, now register as genuinely threatening rather than survivable. Gaming, cannabis, and nicotine each offer, in their own way, an immediate and reliable escape from that threat, a way to regulate discomfort chemically or behaviorally when the internal capacity to regulate it independently was never given the chance to form. And underneath all of it often sits a milder version of the entitlement we discussed earlier, the hedonic adaptation to having needs anticipated and obstacles removed before they were ever fully experienced, which leaves a young adult without the internal evidence, the accumulated proof from lived experience that he is actually capable of doing hard things. None of this reflects a failure of love. It reflects, almost without exception, an abundance of it, offered for 2 decades in a form the developing brain could not convert into the very capacities it would eventually need most. Perhaps this is why Chelsea Handler's conversation resonated so widely, because beneath the discussion of vacation expectations lies a genuinely universal parental dilemma. Every family must eventually decide how responsibility will transfer from one generation to the next. Will younger family members gradually learn to notice, contribute, anticipate, express gratitude, and participate because those capacities were intentionally nurtured? Or will one generation continue carrying an ever-expanding portion of the family's emotional and practical responsibility until resentment gradually replaces generosity? Those are not questions about vacation etiquette. They are questions about the architecture of family life itself. If mothers are frequently socialized to anticipate, organize, and emotionally attune to the countless details sustaining family life, fathers have historically been encouraged to facilitate a different, though equally essential, developmental process. And although every family organizes itself differently, and many mothers embody these qualities, while many fathers assume traditionally maternal roles, developmental psychology consistently reminds us that healthy child development benefits from caregivers who provide both emotional security and expanding opportunity for competence. Competence deserves particular attention here because it remains one of the strongest predictors of resilience across the lifespan. Competence refers to an individual's ability to successfully navigate environmental demand using accumulated knowledge, practical skill, emotional regulation, judgment, and adaptive problem solving, and competence is not inherited. It develops instead through repeated interaction with increasingly complex challenge that stretches but does not overwhelm the individual's current level of functioning. This principle aligns closely with the psychologist Lev Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development, which describes the range of tasks an individual cannot yet perform independently, but can accomplish with appropriate guidance, and effective parenting consistently operates within precisely this developmental space. Since the objective is neither excessive protection nor premature independence, but rather carefully calibrated support that gradually transfers ownership to the child as mastery develops. Bowen Family Systems theory adds another layer to this understanding, since Bowen observed that anxiety influences how families distribute responsibility, and during periods of heightened uncertainty, caregivers often experience a powerful urge to restore equilibrium by assuming greater control over the environment. While this response is entirely understandable, chronic anxiety can inadvertently reorganize a family around a single person's functioning so that as one individual consistently solves problems, anticipates obstacles, negotiates conflict, and absorbs discomfort, another family member may have considerably fewer opportunities to develop those same capacities through lived experience of their own. This principle becomes particularly relevant when we consider a father's role in fostering resilience, a construct often misunderstood as toughness or emotional suppression, when, psychologically, resilience refers to the capacity to adapt effectively following stress, disappointment, adversity, or change while maintaining psychological flexibility and continuing to pursue meaningful goals. Resilience develops not because adversity is absent, but because individuals repeatedly experience manageable challenge and discover, through direct experience, that they possess the capacity to recover. Many fathers intuitively encourage this developmental process, teaching a child how to repair a bicycle, navigate public transportation, prepare a meal, budget money, resolve a disagreement with a friend, or recover after losing an important athletic competition. And although these experiences may appear unrelated on their surface, they share a common psychological function, communicating a powerful message. I believe you are capable of learning this. That message strengthens self-efficacy, which, as discussed earlier, is not optimism, but rather the belief that one's own actions can influence outcome, and each successful experience provides additional neurological evidence that future challenge can be approached with persistence rather than avoidance. Within neurodivergent families, this distinction becomes particularly significant because parents of children with ADHD often witness genuine executive functioning challenges that require thoughtful accommodation. And it can be emotionally difficult to determine when assistance facilitates growth and when assistance inadvertently displaces opportunity for learning. The answer is rarely found in rigid rule. It emerges instead through continuous observation, collaboration, and adjustment. Consider, for example, a 14-year-old with ADHD who repeatedly forgets sports equipment before practice. One response involves the parent permanently assuming responsibility for remembering every item. Another involves responding with frustration and withdrawing support entirely, and neither extreme promotes optimal development. A more therapeutically informed approach involves collaborative scaffolding in which the parent and adolescent might develop a visual equipment checklist posted near the garage, establish a consistent packing routine the evening before practice, and gradually shift responsibility for reviewing that checklist toward the adolescent, so that the external support remains available while ownership steadily increases. The objective is not simply arriving at practice with the correct equipment. The objective is strengthening executive functioning through repeated participation in the planning process itself. Bowen would encourage us to examine what happens emotionally during these particular moments. Does parental anxiety increase when the child struggles? Does that anxiety prompt the caregiver to solve the problem immediately? Does repeated rescue reduce the child's opportunity to experience the natural sequence of planning, forgetting, adapting, and improving? These remain systemic questions rather than individual criticisms. Another construct worth our attention is distress tolerance, the ability to experience uncomfortable emotion without immediately escaping, avoiding, or relying upon another person to eliminate that discomfort. Children who develop healthy distress tolerance gradually learn that frustration, disappointment, embarrassment, uncertainty, and temporary failure are genuinely survivable experiences, and these emotions become information rather than emergency. This developmental process is especially important for individuals with ADHD, who often experience heightened emotional reactivity and increased sensitivity to perceived criticism or rejection. Researchers frequently describe this experience as rejection-sensitive dysphoria, an intense emotional response to real or perceived rejection, criticism, or failure that has been widely observed among people with ADHD, though it is not currently a formal diagnostic criterion, and understanding this pattern helps parents respond with empathy while continuing to support the development of coping skill, emotional regulation, and problem solving rather than inadvertently reinforcing avoidance. Within many families, fathers also contribute meaningfully to the development of agency, the recognition that one's own decisions influence future outcome. Individuals with a strong sense of agency are considerably more likely to ask, "What can I do next?" rather than remaining immobilized by circumstance beyond their control. And agency develops precisely when caregivers consistently communicate through both word and action that effort, persistence, reflection, and adaptation genuinely matter. As you reflect on your own family, consider the following. How was competence developed during your own childhood? Were you encouraged to attempt difficult tasks, or were challenges frequently removed before you ever encountered them? When someone in your family struggled, was the immediate goal to eliminate discomfort, or was the goal to help them develop the skill necessary to navigate that discomfort directly? If you are raising a child with ADHD, how do you distinguish between offering compassionate support and creating genuine opportunity for growing independence? And perhaps most revealing of all, when your child encounters a challenge, which emotion arises in you first? Curiosity, confidence, anxiety, or urgency? Since those emotional responses often shape our parenting long before we consciously recognize them. Bowen reminded us that family change rarely begins by waiting for another person to behave differently. It begins, instead, when one member becomes sufficiently aware of their own emotional process that they respond with greater intentionality rather than automaticity. Parenting, therefore, is not simply the transmission of knowledge. It is the ongoing practice of regulating our own anxiety well enough to allow our children to gradually develop the capacities they will need long after we are no longer standing beside them. Long before two people exchange wedding vows, merge finances, purchase a home, or begin raising children together, they have already begun constructing something remarkably influential, an invisible psychological contract. Unlike a legal contract, this agreement is rarely spoken aloud. It develops instead through observation, repetition, interpretation, and expectation, answering questions neither partner may consciously realize they are asking. Who notices when something needs attention? Who apologizes first? Who plans the weekend? Who initiates difficult conversation? Who remembers birthdays? Who reaches for the check? Who calls after an argument? Who comforts whom? Who carries the emotional weight when life becomes overwhelming? These expectations are seldom negotiated explicitly. Instead, they emerge from what each individual unconsciously learned while growing up. And Bowen Family Systems theory reminds us that no one enters a relationship as a blank slate, since every individual carries forward the emotional patterns, beliefs, coping strategies, relational roles, and adaptive behaviors cultivated within their family of origin. Although these patterns often operate outside conscious awareness, they profoundly influence how adult relationships come to organize themselves across time. Among Bowen's most enduring contributions was the concept of the multi-generational transmission process, which proposes that patterns of emotional functioning, relationship style, anxiety management, and role allocation are transmitted across generations through repeated interaction rather than through direct instruction alone, because children learn considerably more from what they repeatedly observe than from what they are occasionally told. A young man who consistently watched one parent anticipate every family need may unconsciously assume that intimate relationships naturally include one highly organized partner who manages daily life without much visible effort, while a young woman raised within a household in which everyone contributed according to their ability may enter adulthood expecting shared initiative and reciprocal participation as a matter of course. Neither expectation is inherently right or wrong. The challenge emerges precisely when two individuals discover that their assumptions about what is normal differ substantially from one another. This is where cognitive psychology offers another useful concept: implicit schemas, mental frameworks that organize our understanding of the world. Implicit schemas operate largely outside conscious awareness, shaping expectation automatically and influencing what we notice, what surprises us, what disappoints us, and what we assume other people should already know without being told. Consider a seemingly ordinary scenario in which one partner notices that groceries are running low, adds items to the shopping list, schedules a time to visit the store, prepares meals for the week, and replaces household supplies before they are depleted, while the other partner expresses sincere appreciation for the meals, but remains largely unaware of the extensive planning that preceded them. From the perspective of the first partner, the second appears inattentive. From the perspective of the second partner, everything simply seems to get done, and neither interpretation fully captures the underlying psychological reality. The more informative question is this: what developmental experience taught each partner what responsible participation actually looks like? This is why I often encourage couples to move beyond asking, "Who's right?" and to begin asking, instead, "What assumptions are each of us bringing into this relationship?" Notice how dramatically different those conversations become. Instead of, "Why don't you ever think ahead?" the conversation becomes, "Help me understand how planning worked in your family growing up." Instead of, "You never notice what needs to be done," the conversation shifts toward, "What responsibilities were expected of you as a teenager who usually organized family life? And what did appreciation look like in your home?" Those questions reduce defensiveness precisely because they replace accusation with curiosity. Bowen described one of the central developmental tasks of adulthood as differentiation of self, a concept often misunderstood as independence or emotional distance, when, in fact, it refers to the capacity to maintain a clear sense of personal identity while remaining emotionally connected to significant others. Highly differentiated individuals are able to examine inherited family patterns thoughtfully rather than automatically reproducing them. This becomes especially important within romantic relationships because intimate partnership naturally activates attachment history, family expectation, and emotional vulnerability. And during periods of stress, many individuals instinctively revert to familiar relational strategies learned decades earlier. Some pursue reassurance, others withdraw. Some increase control in an effort to reduce anxiety, and others avoid difficult conversation altogether. and these responses frequently reflect adaptive strategies that were functional within one's family of origin, even if they now create genuine challenge within a different relational context. For neurodivergent couples, additional layers of complexity often emerge, since executive functioning difference, sensory sensitivity, emotional intensity, processing speed, and communication preference may all influence how responsibility is experienced and expressed. A partner with ADHD may contribute extraordinary creativity, spontaneity, generosity, humor, and crisis management, while simultaneously experiencing genuine difficulty with perspective memory, time estimation, organization, or task initiation, while another partner may possess exceptional planning ability, yet become increasingly overwhelmed as invisible responsibility accumulates around them. Neither partner's strengths negate the other's challenges. The clinical task is never determining which partner is more responsible. The task is understanding how each partner's neurological profile, developmental history, attachment experience, and family system interact to create the current pattern of reciprocal functioning. Healthy couples eventually learn that fairness is not achieved through identical behavior. Fairness emerges instead through intentional reciprocity, and reciprocity asks a different question than equality does. Rather than asking, "Are we doing exactly the same things?" reciprocity asks, "Are we each contributing meaningfully to the health of this relationship in ways that reflect our present capacities while continuing to expand them over time?" That distinction transforms the conversation entirely, because responsibility is no longer reduced to a chore chart or a scorecard. Responsibility becomes, instead, an expression of emotional maturity, reflecting the willingness to notice, to anticipate, to communicate, to repair, to express gratitude, to remain curious, and to continue developing as an active participant within the relationship, rather than assuming someone else will silently carry what properly belongs to both. As you reflect on your own relationships, consider what unspoken expectations about responsibility you inherited from your family of origin. Which of those expectations continue to serve your relationships well, and which have created recurring misunderstanding instead? When conflict arises, do you become more curious about your partner's developmental history? Or do you become increasingly certain that your own interpretation is the only reasonable one? And perhaps most revealing of all, if your relationship were observed silently for 1 month, what would your daily interaction teach an 8-year-old about responsibility, gratitude, generosity, accountability, and reciprocal participation? Children rarely become what we hope. More often, they become exceptionally skilled observers of what we repeatedly model. One of the most revealing places to observe responsibility is within friendship, because friendship remains one of the few adult relationships that stays almost entirely voluntary. Unlike parents and children, friends are not connected through biology. Unlike spouses, they are not connected through legal commitment or shared financial obligation. Instead, friendships endure because two individuals repeatedly decide that the relationship is worthy of continued investment. That fact alone makes friendship an extraordinarily rich context for understanding reciprocity, emotional maturity, and the psychology of responsibility. From a Bowen Family Systems perspective, friendships do not exist beyond the influence of the family emotional system. Rather, they often become an extension of relational templates developed considerably earlier in life. The ways we initiate connection, tolerate conflict, ask for help, establish boundaries, express appreciation, and repair misunderstanding frequently reflect patterns rehearsed for years within our families of origin, which means friendships offer an opportunity not merely to enjoy companionship, but to recognize which relational habits continue to shape our adult lives. One psychological construct deserving particular attention is reciprocal altruism, a concept originating within evolutionary psychology. referring to the tendency of individuals to provide support, resource, or assistance with the expectation that relationships function through mutual investment sustained across time. Importantly, reciprocal altruism does not imply rigid scorekeeping, since healthy friendships are rarely characterized by exact equality on any given day. Life unfolds unevenly, and one friend may provide considerably greater support during another's illness, while the roles naturally reverse years later, because reciprocity is measured across the life of the relationship rather than within any single interaction. This distinction carries clinical significance, since many people confuse reciprocity with transactional thinking. Transactional relationships operate through immediate exchange. I did this for you, therefore you now owe me. Reciprocal relationships function according to a different logic entirely, grounded in trust that both individuals remain committed to the long-term well-being of the relationship, so that contribution fluctuates according to life circumstance, while the underlying commitment to mutual investment remains stable. Psychologists often describe this as communal orientation, since individuals with a communal orientation derive satisfaction from contributing to the relationship itself, rather than from monitoring whether every exchange is perfectly balanced. At the same time, communal relationships still require genuine awareness, because if one individual consistently gives emotional support, initiates contact, remembers important dates, travels to visit, adjusts their schedule, offers practical assistance, and remains available during periods of crisis, while receiving comparatively little reciprocal investment over an extended period, the relationship gradually becomes vulnerable to emotional exhaustion. This returns us to one of Bowen's most enduring observations. Chronic imbalance frequently generates chronic anxiety, though anxiety does not always announce itself dramatically. More often, it accumulates slowly, so that the friend who always calls first eventually wonders whether the relationship would continue if they stopped initiating. And the friend who consistently provides emotional support begins noticing that conversation rarely includes curiosity about their own life in return. Resentment rarely appears suddenly. It more often represents the emotional residue of needs that remained insufficiently acknowledged across a prolonged period. One concept I frequently discuss with clients is emotional reciprocity, the mutual capacity to recognize, validate, and respond to another person's internal emotional experience. Validation does not require agreement. It communicates instead that another person's emotional experience has been noticed and taken seriously, and friendships characterized by high emotional reciprocity tend to demonstrate considerably greater resilience, because both individuals experience themselves as psychologically significant within the relationship. Within neurodivergent friendships, this process sometimes requires additional intentionality, since ADHD, autism spectrum condition, anxiety disorder, depression, and other neurodevelopmental or psychological difference may influence communication frequency, initiation, memory for dates, sensory preference, social energy, or the capacity to maintain consistent contact during periods of stress. Understanding these differences encourages compassion while simultaneously preserving accountability, because neurodivergence explains certain challenges without eliminating the importance of communicating, repairing misunderstanding, expressing appreciation, and collaboratively developing systems that support the relationship over time. Two close friends, for example, may recognize that remembering birthdays or maintaining regular communication is genuinely difficult for one of them because of executive functioning difference, and rather than interpreting missed contact as evidence of indifference, they might establish shared reminders, recurring calendar events, or a scheduled monthly phone call, so that the neurological challenge is acknowledged without abandoning responsibility altogether. Accommodation and accountability, in other words, can coexist. This distinction is among the most important principles I hope listeners carry forward, because compassion and responsibility are not competing values. Mature relationships require both. Compassion helps us understand why a pattern exists. Responsibility helps us determine how we will respond moving forward. As I reflect on Chelsea Handler's conversation, I find myself thinking considerably less about a vacation and considerably more about a universal human question, since every meaningful relationship eventually asks the same thing of us. Will you participate? Will you notice what needs attention before someone else absorbs it without comment? Will you express gratitude before generosity becomes invisible? Will you repair misunderstanding before resentment becomes the primary language of the relationship? Will you remain curious about another person's experience rather than assuming your own perspective is complete? Will you contribute according to your ability while continuing to expand that ability across time? Those questions transcend celebrity culture entirely, reaching well beyond vacation homes, family dinners, marriages, friendships, and parenting, and speaking directly to the very heart of reciprocal human connection. Perhaps that is why this conversation has resonated so widely, because beneath every discussion about vacation rules lies a considerably older question, one that every generation must answer for itself. What do we owe one another simply because we belong to one another? That question cannot be answered through a checklist. It is answered instead through thousands of ordinary moments in which responsibility becomes visible, not because someone demanded it, but because someone chose to participate fully in the emotional life of the relationships they value. As I reflected further on Chelsea Handler's comments, I realized this conversation was never solely about one family's vacation expectations, nor was it simply about gratitude, etiquette, or privilege. It reflects instead something considerably larger occurring across our society, something Bowen Family Systems theory anticipated decades ago. One of Bowen's 8 foundational concepts is the societal emotional process, which proposed that the same emotional processes observed within families also emerge within organizations, communities, institutions, and entire societies. As chronic anxiety increases, emotional reactivity often rises alongside it. Decisions become increasingly driven by immediate relief rather than thoughtful, long-term adaptation. Polarization intensifies, nuance diminishes, and complex questions become simplified into opposing positions that leave little genuine room for curiosity or reflection. Notice what happened precisely with Chelsea Handler's story, because public discourse organized itself almost immediately around 2 competing narratives. She's absolutely right, or she's completely unreasonable. From a Bowen perspective, those reactions are entirely predictable, since under conditions of heightened emotional intensity, human beings naturally gravitate towards certainty because certainty temporarily reduces anxiety. Unfortunately, certainty can also narrow our capacity to ask deeper questions. Cognitive psychology offers a precise name for one particular version of that narrowing, and it is worth introducing here because it explains a great deal of what filled the comments sections beneath Chelsea Handler's letter. The fundamental attribution error, a concept established through decades of social psychology research, describes our persistent tendency to explain another person's behavior by appealing to their character or personality while underweighting the situational forces that actually produced it, even as we do the reverse for ourselves, explaining our own behavior primarily through circumstance. Applied here, the error looks like this. A great many observers concluded that Chelsea is simply controlling or dramatic or difficult, treating the letter as a straightforward expression of her personality, when a family systems lens asks us instead to consider the years of situational history, the accumulated imbalance, the repeated shortfall of manners, and the gradual erosion of reciprocity that preceded it. The letter was not a personality on display. It was a data point at the end of a long pattern, and the fundamental attribution error is precisely the mechanism that keeps most audiences from seeing that. A second mechanism helps explain something slightly different and slightly more uncomfortable, which is why so many of the people mocking the letter online were very likely recognizing themselves in it at the exact same moment. Cognitive dissonance, a concept developed by the psychologist Leon Festinger, describes the genuine psychological discomfort that arises when a person holds two contradictory beliefs, or a belief and a behavior, at the same time. Reading Chelsea Handler's letter and privately thinking, I do exactly this in my own family, sits very uncomfortably alongside a simultaneous, equally private thought, this is excessive and a little embarrassing to admit to. Rather than sit inside that contradiction, which is genuinely uncomfortable to hold, the far easier resolution is mockery, distancing oneself from the letter entirely so the uncomfortable recognition never has to be examined at all. Ridicule, in other words, is very often not evidence that a person disagrees with what they are reading. It is very often evidence that they agree with it more than they are prepared to admit. Rather than asking whether Chelsea's expectations were appropriate, Bowen would encourage us to ask, instead, what emotional process this conversation reveals about modern families. A question that invites us into a considerably richer discussion. Across much of contemporary society, families navigate unprecedented complexity as parents balance demanding careers while remaining emotionally available to their children. Technology transforms how we communicate, organize our lives, and experience distraction. And young adults enter adulthood amid rising housing cost, student debt, economic uncertainty, and rapidly shifting social expectation. Neurodevelopmental conditions such as ADHD are more widely recognized than they once were, leading many families to pursue accommodations that provide meaningful support while simultaneously wrestling with an equally important developmental question: how do we support growth without inadvertently reducing opportunity to develop competence? This is not a simple question, nor should it be, because healthy families rarely operate from absolutes. They continually adjust, observe, communicate, and recalibrate as children's developmental capacity evolves. What is appropriate at age 6 differs substantially from what is appropriate at 16, 26, or 46. And responsibility is not static. It evolves alongside maturation, changing life circumstance, neurological difference, and the reciprocal needs of the family system. I also believe our culture sometimes confuses two psychological constructs that deserve to remain distinct: compassion and accommodation. Compassion is the capacity to recognize another person's suffering with empathy, dignity, and a genuine desire to help. And compassion strengthens relationships because it communicates. In effect, I see you, I understand your struggle, and I want to walk alongside you. Accommodation, by contrast, refers to altering the environment or one's own behavior in response to another person's need. And accommodations can be extraordinarily beneficial, allowing individuals with genuine neurological, developmental, or physical difference to access opportunities that might otherwise remain unnecessarily difficult to reach. The clinical question is not whether accommodations should exist, since they absolutely should when they meaningfully increase participation and access. The more sophisticated question is whether a given accommodation increases long-term functioning, or whether it has gradually become a substitute for developmental growth instead. As clinicians, educators, parents, and coaches, we return to this question repeatedly, because effective intervention always seeks to increase an individual's capacity over time rather than simply managing their difficulty in the present moment. This distinction becomes especially important within neurodivergent families, since children and adults with ADHD often benefit tremendously from visual schedules, body doubling, external reminders, structured routines, environmental modification, coaching, collaborative planning, and thoughtfully designed executive functioning supports, interventions that are genuinely evidence-informed and often life-changing. Yet the ultimate objective remains developmental progression, and the calendar is not the goal, the checklist is not the goal, and the reminder is not the goal. The goal is strengthening executive functioning, increasing self-awareness, expanding self-management, and fostering the confidence that develops when individuals experience themselves as capable contributors within their families, workplaces, friendships, and communities. This is why I so often return to the concept of agency, the recognition that my choices matter, my contribution matters, my preparation matters, my gratitude matters, and my willingness to notice another person's effort matters. Agency transforms responsibility from something imposed externally into something embraced internally. As I listened to people debate Chelsea Handler's vacation expectations, I found myself wondering whether we were asking the wrong question entirely. Perhaps the more meaningful question is not, should families have rules, but rather, how do healthy families intentionally cultivate adults who naturally notice, contribute, appreciate, repair, and participate because those values have become integrated into their identity? That question extends well beyond one vacation, reaching into every dinner table conversation, every marriage, every friendship, every classroom, every athletic team, every workplace, every family gathering, and every generation that follows. Ultimately, Bowen Family Systems theory reminds us that meaningful change rarely begins by waiting for everyone else to behave differently. It begins, instead, when one person develops sufficient awareness to recognize the emotional patterns unfolding around them and chooses to respond with greater intentionality, greater emotional maturity, and greater differentiation of self. Perhaps Chelsea Handler's story has remained in public conversation precisely because, whether we realized it consciously or not, it prompted us to examine our own relationships. Who carries the invisible responsibility within my family without comment? What assumptions have I inherited without ever examining them? Where has generosity and gratitude remained beautifully reciprocal? And where has expectation steadily replaced appreciation instead? And perhaps the question I hope every listener carries forward long after this episode ends is this. If someone observed the ordinary interaction within my family for the next 30 days, what would they conclude? We are teaching one another about responsibility, not through our words, but through our daily lives, because families are always teaching. And the only real question is, what curriculum is being lived each day? As we arrive at the end of today's conversation, I want to leave you with one final thought. When Murray Bowen developed family systems theory, he did not set out to create another model that encouraged people to identify the person causing the problem. In fact, one reason I have returned to Bowen's work throughout my career is that it asks us to replace judgment with observation, certainty with curiosity, and blame with understanding, a shift that is genuinely liberating. It means that when we observe a young adult struggling to assume responsibility, our first question is never, what's wrong with them? But rather a curious inquiry into the developmental experience, executive functioning demand, reinforcement history, relationship pattern, and emotional process that contributed to this present moment. Likewise, when we observe a parent who appears exhausted from carrying a family's invisible responsibility, we resist the temptation to conclude that they simply need better boundaries, and instead become curious about the anxiety circulating within the family system, the roles that gradually developed across time, and the reciprocal patterns that allowed one person's extraordinary competence to become another person's expected normal. Curiosity is among the most clinically powerful interventions we possess. Curiosity lowers defensiveness. Curiosity increases psychological flexibility. Curiosity expands perspective taking, the cognitive capacity to appreciate another person's internal experience while recognizing that our own interpretation represents only one part of a considerably larger story. Perhaps that is one of the greatest gifts Bowen left us, since he reminded us that families are not collections of isolated individuals making independent decisions, but living emotional systems in which every interaction influences the next, every adaptation reshapes the system, and every generation inherits pattern while simultaneously possessing the opportunity to thoughtfully modify it. That is an extraordinarily hopeful idea because it means that meaningful change does not require waiting until every member of the family agrees. It begins instead with one person increasing their awareness, one parent becoming more intentional, one spouse becoming more curious, one friend expressing appreciation that previously remained unspoken, one adult child recognizing an inherited expectation and thoughtfully deciding whether it still serves the relationships they hope to build, one conversation that interrupts a pattern repeated for decades, and one moment of reflection before reacting automatically. Psychologists often describe this capacity as metacognition, our ability to think about our own thinking, to step outside immediate emotional reaction and observe the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral processes unfolding within us. Metacognition allows us to ask why we are responding this way, what assumptions we are making, what patterns we are repeating, and whether those patterns still serve the relationships we value most. And that capacity is foundational both to growth and to differentiation of self. Differentiation is not achieved in a single dramatic moment. It develops gradually through thousands of ordinary decisions to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. Most importantly, it reminded us that responsibility is considerably more than remembering to complete a task, because responsibility reflects an evolving awareness that every relationship asks something of us: to notice, to contribute, to communicate, to repair, to appreciate, to remain curious, and to continue growing. If today's episode prompted you to see your family, your marriage, your friendships, your parenting, or even your own patterns through a different lens, I hope you will carry that curiosity forward across the coming week. Rather than asking who is doing enough and who is not, begin asking different questions instead. What responsibilities have become invisible because they are carried so consistently? Where has generosity remained beautifully reciprocal? Where have assumptions replaced conversation without anyone noticing? What strengths are emerging within my family that deserve greater recognition? And what capacities am I intentionally developing in the people I love? Those questions rarely produce immediate answers, and what they produce instead is awareness. And awareness is very often where lasting change begins. This week's path to peace. Pause. 2 questions this week, and I want you to sit with both of them rather than answering quickly. First, somewhere in your own family, are you currently the one who pays for the experience or the one who receives it? And what is one specific thing you could do this month from wherever you sit, naming the real cost out loud if you provide, or offering something that has nothing to do with money if you receive? Second, think of one place in your child's life, or your own, where a difficulty has been resolved for years before it was ever allowed to become genuinely difficult, and ask yourself honestly what that person has learned about whether their own effort actually matters. If you want to put today's episode into practice rather than simply think about it, the companion piece for this conversation is the Chelsea Handler Family Vacation Worksheet, a fillable Patreon companion with space to set your family's own non-negotiables, assign the chores and time frames before anyone packs a bag, and sign a short family agreement together. It is built to be filled out at the kitchen table, not read alone, and it is exactly the kind of conversation this episode has been asking you to have. Thank you for spending this time with me today. It remains a genuine privilege to join you in these conversations and to explore the psychology that shapes our everyday lives. And if this episode resonated with you, consider sharing it with a parent, partner, educator, coach, therapist, or friend, because conversations like these become even more meaningful when they continue around dinner tables, in classrooms, on athletic fields, in therapy offices, and within the families we all hope to strengthen. Until next time, take good care of yourselves, take good care of one another, and remember that every thoughtful interaction has the potential to change the emotional trajectory of a family for generations to come.